In March of 2018, in a settlement in the Canadian Arctic, a man handed in his rifle. He was a Canadian Ranger, one of the part-time patrols who watched the top of the world, mostly Inuit and First Nations men and women who know that country better than any regular army ever could. The rifle he handed in was a Lee Enfield. It was older than he was. Some of the rifles handed in that year were older than his father, and the cartridge it fired, the cartridge those patrols had carried since 1947, the cartridge sitting in the pouch on his belt, had been designed in 1888. Stop for a second and think about what 1888 actually means. Victoria had another 13 years left to reign. There were no aeroplanes and no tanks. The motor car was a novelty that frightened horses. Smokeless powder had only just been invented on the continent, and Britain had not yet worked out how to make it properly. So, when the War Office adopted its new small-bore cartridge that December, it filled it with gunpowder. That cartridge was the .303 British, and when the last of those Rangers handed in their rifles, it had been in continuous military service for 130 years. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel. It's the one thing that keeps them coming. And here is the strange thing about it. Nothing about the .303 was ahead of its time. Almost everything about it was behind. It has a rim, a raised lip around the base of the case. The same basic idea as a Victorian hunting cartridge at the exact moment the rest of the world was moving to sleek rimless cases that stacked cleanly in a magazine. It was built around a propellant it abandoned within 4 years. It is fat. It is slow by modern standards. And for a century, any ballistician who looked at it could tell you precisely what was wrong with it, and it buried the lot of them. It outlived 4 generations of rifles built around it. It outlived the companies that made it and the arsenals that filled it. It outlived the empire it was designed to arm. There are men watching this right now in Canada and Australia and New Zealand and South Africa and Britain who will go out this season and put meat on the table with a cartridge that was already considered obsolete before the First World War. And the reason it survived as long as it did is not an entirely comfortable one. Because at one point, Britain took this cartridge, put a small piece of aluminium inside the nose of the bullet, and quietly turned it into something that did the exact job an international treaty had just forbidden her from doing. It was legal. That was the entire point of it. So, how did a black powder cartridge from 1888 end up outliving the empire that made it? And what exactly did Britain build into it in 1910 that she has never much liked to talk about? The cartridge that came first. Start with the thing everybody gets backwards. We tend to tell these stories the wrong way round. We talk about the rifle, and the cartridge is treated as an accessory, the thing the rifle happens to eat. With the .303, it is the other way round, and it is the other way round for 130 years. The cartridge is the constant. The rifles come and go around it. The first rifle built for it was not the Lee Enfield at all. It was the Lee Metford, adopted in that same period, a James Paris Lee action, the Scotsman who gave the world that beautiful rear-locking bolt, married to a barrel, rifled on William Metford's system, with shallow, rounded grooves, designed to resist the fouling that black powder throws down a bore. And that first cartridge was a proper Victorian object, a brass case with a rim, a round-nosed bullet weighing 215 grains, jacketed in cupro nickel, and behind it a compressed charge of black powder. It left the muzzle at around 1,830 feet per second, respectable for the day, and enormously better than the huge, slow lead bullets that had come before it. There was one decision buried in that design that mattered more than anything else, and it is the rim. By 1888, the clever money was already on rimless cases, a case with a groove machined into the base rather than a lip standing proud of it, so that cartridges sit flat against each other and feed straight up out of a magazine. The Germans went that way. The Americans went that way. Britain kept the rim because the rim was simple, because it gave the cartridge a positive stop in the chamber that was easy to manufacture to, and because every plant in the country was already tooled for it. Hold on to that, because that single decision reaches right through the next century. It shapes the Lee Enfield's bolt. It bends the Brenz magazine into that famous curve. It causes a fault that jammed rifles in the mud of the Western Front, and it is the reason that when Britain finally did try to modernize, she found she could not simply rebarrel her way out of it. Now that black powder cartridge lasted about 3 years. In late 1891, after a great deal of testing, the Committee on Explosives settled on cordite, an extruded propellant of nitroglycerin, gun cotton, and mineral jelly, pressed out in long strands like spaghetti, and laid down inside the case in a bundle. Anyone who has pulled apart old British ammunition has seen it. Cordite pushed the same bullet from 1,830 feet per second to around 1,970. And it did it without the great white cloud that had been giving away every rifleman's position since the invention of gunpowder. It was a genuine leap, and it immediately destroyed the rifle it was loaded into. Cordite burns far hotter than black powder. Metford's shallow, rounded rifling, the very thing that had made the rifle so good with the old load, simply eroded away. Barrels were washing out in a few thousand rounds. The answer came from the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield, which cut a deeper, squarer form of rifling that could stand the heat, and the rifle was renamed accordingly. That is worth saying plainly, because it is the whole thesis of this video in one line. The Lee Metford became the Lee Enfield because of a change to the cartridge. The rifle was renamed to accommodate the ammunition. The most famous British rifle in history carries the name it carries because of the .30-03, the Dum-Dum scandal. And then almost immediately, Britain ran into a problem that has nothing to do with engineering. On the northwest frontier and later in the Sudan, British officers began filing complaints of a very particular kind. The new small-bore, full-jacketed, round-nosed bullet was punching straight through a man and carrying on. It made a neat hole against a determined charge at close quarters. A neat hole was not stopping people. The answer came out of the Dum-Dum arsenal on the outskirts of Kolkata, where a British officer named Neville Bertie Clay took the standard Mark II bullet and exposed the soft lead at its tip. Production of that modified round began there in the middle of the 1890s, and it was used on the frontier and in the Sudan in 1898. It worked exactly as intended, and it caused a scandal that has not finished yet, because the name of that arsenal, a suburb of Kolkata, a place most Britons could not have found on a map, detached itself from the place and went round the world. Dum-Dum is in French, it is in German, it is in Russian, it is in languages spoken by people who have never heard of India. More than a century later, most people who use the word have no idea they are naming a British ammunition factory in Bengal. At the Hague Conference in 1899, the British delegation argued its corner, largely on the grounds of colonial policing. The German delegation objected, and objected effectively. The conference adopted a declaration under which the signatories agreed to abstain from the use of bullets which expand or flatten easily in the human body, specifically naming bullets with a hard envelope which does not entirely cover the core or which is cut with incisions. That is a precise description of what Britain had been making at Dum-Dum. Britain lost the argument. And this is where the story gets uncomfortable, because Britain did not decide to accept a less effective bullet. Britain decided to obey the letter of the declaration and get the same result anyway. The answer took a decade to arrive and was adopted in 1910. It is called the Mark VII, and if you have ever fired British military surplus, this is the round you fired. On the outside, the Mark VII is unimpeachable. It is a pointed, streamlined Spitzer bullet weighing 174 grains, and its cupro-nickel jacket covers the core completely. There is no exposed lead, and there are no incisions. Held up at a conference table, it is exactly what the declaration demands. Inside, it is something else. The Mark VII does not have a lead core running the full length of it. In the nose sits a plug of a much lighter material, aluminium in the original specification, and later, when aluminium became a strategic metal in wartime, compressed wood pulp or fiber or paper with the lead seated behind it. The consequence is a bullet whose center of gravity is not where it looks like it should be. It is tail-heavy. In the air, this does not matter, because the spin imparted by the rifling holds it point forward and stable. In fact, the Mark VII is a superbly accurate round. Men are still winning matches at 1,000 yards with it. But the instant it strikes something dense enough to slow it down, that heavy base tries to overtake the light nose, and the bullet yaws violently. Britain had signed a treaty prohibiting a bullet that deformed on impact. So Britain built one that stayed intact and turned sideways instead. Same effect. No expansion, fully jacketed, entirely legal. Whether you regard that as a piece of brilliant engineering or as a piece of extremely deliberate lawyering probably depends on where you are standing. And I am not going to tell you which it is. But it is the reason the round earned the reputation it earned in the trenches. And it is the honest answer to the question of why the Taut 303 lasted. It was not merely adequate. It did the job with a completeness that made replacing it a difficult argument to win for the next 50 years. The rifle and the rim. And it was accurate. And it was fast to shoot. And in the hands of the pre-war British regular soldier, the combination became a legend of its own. 15 aimed rounds a minute was the standard demanded. The good ones did considerably better. And there are men in the comments of every video we make who will tell you exactly what a 10-round Enfield magazine feels like when the bolt is running properly. What made that possible was as much the cartridge as the rifle. A rimmed case gives a loader something to feel. The rim is a physical stop, and a man working a bolt in the dark or in mud or with cold hands can seat a charger by touch in a way that is genuinely harder with a smooth, rimless case. The thing the designers of 1900 thought of as a compromise turned out, in the specific conditions of a European trench, to be an advantage nobody had planned for. That happens more often in the history of weapons than anybody likes to admit. Then look at what the rim built, because that Victorian lip on the base of the case shaped almost every British weapon of the first half of the 20th century. The Lee Enfield's magazine has to be loaded with the rims stepping correctly forward of one another, or the rounds catch, the fault every old soldier knows as rim lock, and the reason recruits were drilled endlessly on charger loading. The Vickers gun was fed through a fabric belt built around it. The Bren, which began life as a Czech design chambered for a rimless German cartridge, had to be substantially redrawn to swallow a rimmed one, and that is the entire explanation for its beautiful, curved, top-mounted magazine. Straighten the magazine, and you are not looking at a Bren anymore. When the gun was later converted to the rimless NATO round as the L4, the magazine straightened out immediately. Look up at a Spitfire or a Hurricane in 1940, and you are looking at 8 Browning machine guns in the wings, all of them firing the 303. That is the cartridge that fought the Battle of Britain out of the wings of fighters. At the same moment, it was being fired from a bolt-action rifle designed for black powder. Both of those things were the same round. The retirement that never was. And here the story turns. By the 1950s, the argument was finally lost. NATO standardized on a rimless 7.62mm cartridge, and in 1957 Britain adopted the L1A1 rifle to fire it. The Bren was converted. The Enfields were withdrawn from the front line, sold off, shipped abroad, or stacked in stores. On paper, after 69 years, the .303 was finished, except it was not finished at all. It simply stopped being the front line and became everything else. The Royal Air Force was still issuing Lee Enfields to men who joined in 1966 and 1967, who did their weapon training on a rifle designed in the Victorian era, and only converted to the self-loader when they were posted abroad. The cadet forces were still shooting them at the end of the 1960s. Competitors at Bisley were still putting them on the 1,000-yard range in the 1980s, and putting their shots inside the target with iron sights. And beyond Britain, the round did not retire at all. There are British soldiers who were training in the Libyan desert in 1968 and found Bedouin tribesmen carrying Lee Enfields and men crossing the mountains from Abu Dhabi into Oman in 1986 who found the same thing. Police forces in the Caribbean and Central America carried them into the 2000s. India kept a factory at Ishapur building Enfields long after the country that designed them had stopped, and the Canadian Rangers carried the No. 4 in the Arctic in genuine service until the C-19 finally replaced it in March of 2018. That is where the 130 years comes from, and it is worth being precise about it because it is not a marketing number. 1888 to 2018, adopted under Queen Victoria, retired under Queen Elizabeth II. Not a museum piece, but a rifle issued to a serving military unit in a country that could afford anything it liked. Because in 50 degrees of frost, the thing still worked. The factories did not last nearly as well. Kynoch at Witton in Birmingham filled British service ammunition for generations. The Royal Laboratory at Woolwich Arsenal, which had been at that work in one form or another since the 17th century, stopped manufacturing in 1967. The Witton site was finally vacated in 2003 after more than 140 years. If you are from Birmingham, you know exactly what that sentence means, and you have watched it happen to more than one trade in that city. The Cartridge outlived every one of them, which is a peculiar kind of monument. The product still here, the works long gone, and the men who built it gone with them. And there is one detail about that which I think is the best thing in this entire story, and hardly anybody mentions it. Turn a British service round over and look at the base. Stamped into the head of the case, around the primer, there is a code for the factory that made it, and the year it was made. That is all it is. A couple of letters and 2 digits pressed into brass by a machine, by somebody being paid piecework, who is certainly dead now. Which means that if you have a tin or a bandolier of old 303 in a drawer, and a great many people watching this do, because it came with a grandfather's rifle, and nobody quite knew what to do with it, you can pick a single round out of it and read where in Britain it was made and in what year. 1942, 1917, a works in Birmingham that stopped existing before you were born. It is the closest thing to a signature that industrial production leaves behind, and it is sitting in a lot of sheds and lofts right now, unread. The cartridge that still hunts. And that is why, if you go into a gun shop in Ontario or Queensland or the Eastern Cape, the 303 is still on the shelf. It is not there for collectors. It is there because it is a good deer and boar and kudu round, and always was. There are men in South Africa taking kudu bulls with it in their 70s on the same 174 grain bullet weight the Army adopted in 1910. There are men in Eastern Canada whose local hardware shop still stocks it. There are Australians shooting rifles built at Lithgow in 1915 that they bought for $100 in the 1980s. Be honest about the state of it though, because they will be. Factory ammunition has become expensive and it is not always on the shelf, which is why so many of the people who shoot it seriously now load their own. The brass is thick and it lasts. The rifles are getting older and the good ones are getting harder to find. And a great many of them were cut down and sporterized in the 1950s and 60s when they were worth almost nothing, which is a small tragedy that a whole generation of collectors is still quietly annoyed about. There is one more honest thing to say, and it is the thing that has ruined more good barrels than any battle. Almost all of the old British military ammunition was loaded with corrosive priming, a compound that leaves a residue of salt in the bore after firing, which then pulls moisture out of the air and quietly rusts the rifling from the inside. Cleaned properly that same day with hot water, it does no harm whatever. And thousands of these rifles are still shooting beautifully a century on because somebody was disciplined about it. Left in a corner over a wet British winter, it eats a barrel. If you have ever picked up an Enfield with a mirror bore and wondered why it survived when its neighbor on the rack is pitted gray, that is the whole difference. Not luck. Somebody's habits, decades ago. And that is the part of this that I think matters most, and the reason we make these. Somewhere in this audience, there is a rifle in a cabinet that a father or a grandfather brought home with a tin of this ammunition beside it. And the man who could have explained where it came from is not around to ask anymore. If that is you, tell us in the comments what you have and where it came from. Those are always the best comments under these videos, and they are, in the end, the only record of any of this that is still being written. The final reflection: step back and look at the shape of it. A cartridge is adopted in 1888, filled with gunpowder, with a rim on it that half the world's designers already thought was old-fashioned. Within 3 years, the propellant is changed, and the change is so aggressive that it destroys the rifling of the rifle it was built for. So the rifle is redesigned and renamed, and takes the name it is famous by to this day. Within 7 years, the Empire finds the bullet too humane for its own purposes, modifies it in Bengal, and gives every language on Earth a word it still uses without knowing where it came from. Britain is told at The Hague to stop, and stops, and then spends 10 years engineering a round that obeys the treaty word for word, and does the same thing anyway. That round then arms the trenches, feeds 8 machine guns in the wing of a Spitfire, bends the magazine of the Bren into a curve, is officially replaced in 1957, and carries on being issued to airmen, cadets, colonial police, Bedouin tribesmen, Indian factories, and Arctic patrols for another 61 years after its own retirement. The empire it was made to arm no longer exists. The arsenal at Woolwich has stopped, the works at Witten are gone, Enfield is closed, and the Cartridge is still on the shelf, still being loaded, still being fired, still killing deer in Nova Scotia and kudu in the Eastern Cape. 138 years after somebody in a committee room decided that a rim would be simpler to manufacture, every rifle built around it has a museum case somewhere. The 3303 never needed one. We will see you in the next one.